Hello, everyone, and welcome to another conversation. Today, we're going to be looking at the ways in which histories of global health, their understandings, and thinking about the ways that we've moved from an era of colonial medicine through to something that we refer to as global health, and to see what the implications that ultimately might mean in the field of migration and health. So for us to begin unpacking this and thinking particularly about current approaches to thinking through decolonizing global health, particularly within the context of South Africa, Southern Africa, and the continent, I'm delighted to bring two guests to join us who have a wealth of insight, experience, energy, and enthusiasm. And I'm really excited that we're able to introduce Lance Luskita and Shanaz Munshi, both of whom bring exciting opportunities, I think, for reflecting both on their own experiences as earlier career scholars and as their experiences as scholars who are pushing decolonial agendas, but pushing them in critical ways. And I'm really excited to welcome you both here. What I'd like to do is give you a chance to introduce yourselves and your interests, and from there we will move into a couple of questions so that we can have a dialogue and really get into what this thing we call global health is and what it means for us in the context of South Africa. So Lance, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jo, and thank you for the opportunity to engage with us, both Shanaz and I. So I'm Lance Luskita, as Jo has mentioned, and I'm currently a PhD candidate in the Health Systems and Policy Research Division in the School of Public Health and Family Medicine at the University of Cape Town. And I am, I'm currently, my PhD focuses on queer users' experiences of the interactions with the health system at primary healthcare level. And a lot of my interest in both research and my advocacy or activism in the academic space and the research space is really the frustration with wanting to engage in research that is actively calling and naming oppressive power and also addressing it. And so the decolonial work, and particularly a decolonial lens, has really helped to me in my research and my activism to think about how my own political work and my political agenda can help move or advance socially just health systems. And so that's really the premise of how I step into this conversation, is that I've been involved in a number of different projects trying to advocate or to address oppressive power, whether it's the work in the decriminalization of sex work in South Africa, or understanding the health system as heteronormative and problematizing the ways in which the health system have alienated queer people, and as well as a number of different other projects and naming race and Black subjectivity and the treatment of Black bodies when those bodies interact with the health system, and understanding the history of the health system has been important, and the colonial history has been important. And so that's a broad framing of my own political stance, and trying to think about African health systems and to advance a social justice agenda in African health systems. Decolonial and decolonizing theory has been imperative. So thank you so much for having me and for me to contribute to the conversation and the work of ACMS.
Brilliant, thanks so much, Lance. And as you say, it's so important to gain an insight into our own respective personal and political positions and histories and understandings, and seeing how that is influencing the ways in which we're engaging in certain issues. But I think importantly, it's also about, in a way, learning how to engage with that in our work. I've found so often in my training as a grad student, it was very much sort of your own position was quite often pushed out of the training, specifically those of us who are coming from a kind of public health background, and this sort of idea that somehow we could perform our research and our research agendas in ways that are perceived to be apolitical, even though public health itself is based on a political approach, really, and the ways in which we understand the importance of health and well-being. So yeah, I really appreciate that. So thanks, Lance. And Shanaz, over to you.
Hi, Joe. It's lovely to be in a Zoom room with you and to be in a space where in ACMS, actually, just to return and really engage here. Also to just be invited to have this conversation in an African space. I think it's very special because this is where I think Lance and I have tried to orientate and really would like the work to be located. So for me, I think the work really started around questions that I've had ever since I worked in the public sector as a South African occupational therapist in both rural and urban South Africa, where even in a post-apartheid context, I came across too many people that really were in devastating conditions, both health and social conditions. And it left me with a lot of questions around what is my role as an occupational therapist in really helping or healing, and what does this mean for me? And the questions remained as I traveled to the UK, but I had no language for it, and I didn't really have an understanding or a grounding of how to make sense of those injustices that I was seeing around me, or even in the UK, in a much more developed health system, where I worked with marginalized communities there from Bangladesh, from Somalia, from Eastern Europe, and still where those who are people of color and those who are racialized, those who don't speak English well, experienced a very different kind of health than those who were white and English and had louder voices or were able to complain. And it felt like there was a lot of inequities that were mirrored in these two places, but I still didn't have a way of understanding it. And then I came to public health, but felt like there was an element of progressive politics in the understanding of social determinants of health. But I felt very frustrated because I didn't think that it was going far enough. And it really wasn't kind of making sense of the global imperial design that was shaping the structures and systems that existed today. And in the UK, I did a course with the People's Health Movement called the International People's Health Movement, where I was introduced to the politics of the World Health Organization and some of these global health initiatives that were really shaping the experience of health and access to services in countries in the global south, but with the asymmetrical power. And I suppose being in South Africa at a time when the Rhodes and Fees Must Fall movement were held, the access to decolonial scholars really energized me, and I had a realization that actually this is part of where we need to start beginning to engage more critically and deeply to understand some of these historical forces. And I think there's many decolonial scholars from the continent that inspire me. And one is Sabelo Ndlovu Gacheni, who was saying that, decolonization has to remain a revolutionary term with theoretical and practical value. And both Lance and I have met each other through a fellowship called the Atlantic Fellows for Health Equity. And in the fellowship, we were making some of the links with, for example, Lance's work on sex work, my work on community health workers, where we took a gendered lens to understanding how women carry the economy, yet they marginalized and they carry a burden of care and so many responsibilities for the health and well-being of those who really suffer the most, yet they remain impoverished and they remain quite siloed. And for me, in a context where the country is shifting towards an NHI, the question is, what does this revolution look like? What needs to happen to shape and shake up or change And they talk about re-engineering primary healthcare. This is one of my master's topic on community health workers. But the re-engineering or this revolution of primary healthcare seemed to be a very something that was in words and not really action. It seemed to be yet another paper and not really a revolution that was happening on the ground to shift the conditions of the majority of people who don't access healthcare, or who are accessing poor quality primary healthcare in the public sector. Yeah, so I think that's where we come into the conversation, and I'm glad to continue it and to, learn and read some more and just have a deeper understanding of these issues.
Great, thank you. And Shanaz, thank you also for sort of reminding us of where we are. We're recording this in 2021 at the end of August. We are, within the throes of a pandemic that is obviously highlighting and spotlighting, people are using the term amplifying, all of the existing inequities that have been present for decades in relation to access to good healthcare, access to social support, is amplifying the gendered experiences that we're seeing in the terms of care, in the terms of access to work, to support, so on, not only in South Africa, but elsewhere. And it's led to some sort of saying, well, we can use these experiences to support us pushing the National Health Insurance Agenda, the NHI. And I know some people who are going to be engaging with the conversation perhaps don't know what the NHI is. And I thought before we move to talking more about kind of what global health is and what we think we want it to be, I wondered, Shanaz, if you could just briefly, just perhaps sort of give people a flavor of what NHI is, what its ambitions are, particularly for people who aren't familiar with the South African healthcare system. So nothing too detailed, but just something that can help people catch up with what we're referring to around the NHI.
Yeah. So I guess the NHI is national. It's the term stands for National Health Insurance, but it's really a policy choice, a finance mechanism that was chosen by the South African government in response to the global call for universal health coverage, which is really trying to bring universal access to healthcare for all. And the term is quite contested because it exists in a finance structure that is designed to extract an extractive economy that isn't necessarily able to produce this desired goal, but it really is trying to bring universal health care for all. And in the South African context, we have started to see universal health access from 1994, when Nelson Mandela's first policy initiative in health was to deliver basic primary health care for all and for mothers and children. So South Africa does have universal health care in some instances, but then once you start unpacking what it looks like, it's across the country. There's major inequities. And you have inequities in all elements in terms of access, in terms of coverage, safety, quality, healthcare workers, differences in so many different things. And I suppose it reflects in our health outcomes. So we aren't really, as a country, the amount of finance we put into the country for health, both in the public and the private sector, we don't really get the health outcomes that we are looking for. So this universal, the UHC, the NHI initiative is really an attempt to try to pool the money from the private and the public sector together so that we can restructure the way that health is both purchased and provided, so that those who need it the most can access care and in an equitable way. And so I urge all of us to continue to look out for how this policy is shaping out, because in a COVID-19 context, the power dynamics have shifted, and we might see the private sector really make bigger decisions about how it ends up playing out. And it may not really be universal access. It actually may reinforce some of the inequities that currently exist.
Thanks for that background. And I think in a way, the language of inequity, so when we're talking about not simply inequality where something is unfair, unfairly distributed, is not distributed equally. We're talking about something that is unfair in the way that it's poorly distributed. And I think it's important that we also, remind ourselves sometimes why we choose to make use of particular terms in the ways in which we're engaging. So, for example, using the term inequity not only is correct factually, but it's important politically, because it is reminding ourselves and those that we're engaging with that we're not simply saying there are differences. We're not saying that something is unequal. We're saying things are unequal in ways that are unjust, and that's what needs to be addressed. And in a way, it, I think, helps us sort of lead into thinking more then about, well, how does this fit into what this idea of global health is? I think, maybe Lance, I could come to you, is that we know that universal healthcare coverage is just one of many global health sort of governance architectures that exists, that's tabled out in the boardrooms of Geneva and is sort of comes across as this sort of global agenda. And we know it's not as straightforward as that. And we know that the geopolitics and how these sorts of initiatives are developed and are put on the table, questions of who's at the table and so on. And Shanaz, you were speaking about your experiences in being engaged through the People's Health Movement to that, and governance processes being something that are absolutely not apolitical, and how do we bring that into our work and our training and so on. So just linked to that, Lance, I was just wondering if you might want to share your thoughts on what is global health? What do we want it to be? Is it something that is helpful to achieving the goals we want it to achieve?
Thank you, Jo, for the question. I think that in addressing that question, it's important that we understand that the predecessors of global health, among other things, including tropical medicine, were an instrument of colonization, and that global health has really never fully shared this colonial past. And so, what I mean by that is that through the systems and structures that were put in place by the colonial project and by the colonizers, tropical medicine and colonial medicine was instrumentalized to support the colonialists' overall aim to steal, to dominate, to destroy, to occupy, to manipulate and oppress. And so it's important for us to understand the global health structure or governance structure as part of this global imperial design. And more significantly is that the colonizers' oppression extended to destroying and changing our ways of being, our ways of doing, our ways of thinking. And so what is quite important for global health, and in this question of global, or this quest of global health, is really fundamentally thinking for ourselves as emerging scholars who, and for my own positionality, who don't necessarily who's part of the othered subject or the subaltern, that we need to think about the reorientation of our systems that previously served a white supremacist and a modernity, a capitalist and a neoliberalist and industrial kind of agenda, and to be able to name global health as being part of those, or at least implicit or explicit in how it has been configured, and all the actions through this kind of structure, that it created the conditions of hegemony, that it's part of the structural violence project historically and contemporary, although in very nuanced and ubiquitous ways. And it's still part of reinforcing and perpetuating oppression. And so these are all infused in our training institutions, such as the universities, the schools of tropical medicines, as well as our disciplines and our fields, anthropology, geography, architecture, philosophy, economics, etc., as well as how healthcare systems are configured, policy structures, our social welfare systems, our arts, religion, and language. And so in understanding this, and this is what Ramon Grosfoguel really termed as kind of the Western university, and how, you know, these colonial universities or these Western universities have been replicated as part of the colonial project. And so in understanding, or at least in problematizing global health, it's also important that we recognize that we are products of these institutions. We are products of the global health structure. And we are part of that legacy of colonization. And so, and my subjective experience has been this process of alienation, othering, and feeling of dehumanization that I've experienced personally as a scholar, as a patient in the health system, as someone navigating the university space, and as a researcher who's also going into communities and doing research. Has been really, really important to understand the complicity of the global health structure and the complicity of myself. And so, what I've been grappling with is what does it require for me as a scholar? What renaming needs to happen? And so you know, there's a history where our schools at the School of Public Health has been quite intentionally in resisting the kind of global health language for a particular reason and a political reason. And so embracing public health has been an important part of this reconfiguring, and also contesting the global imperial design project that forms part of the global health agenda. And so for myself then, and Shanaz can also talk a little bit more on this issue of naming, of understanding the framing of global health as being important, is that we need to be able to be quite intentional in thinking about how global health and its institutions and the structures, that it is part of the modern and colonial project. And so, and it was part of the epistemicide project, which is kind of the destruction of indigenous and African knowledges. And so when we have to rethink and reframe this global health away from the Eurocentric and North American framing, we need to be able to think about our own disobedience, our own epistemic disobedience, and our own liberation as emerging scholars. And what will it take to de-link from that history? What will it take for us to also address that violent history and do so in ways where we can achieve justice and equity? And so, you know, it's important in our project of decolonizing, of thinking about decoloniality as an intentional political approach, is this critique of global health framings, as well as low and middle income country framings, and be able to really understand ourselves as researchers, activists, and professionals, not only as recipients of inbound knowledge and technologies, or as empirical fodder for the Western theoretical project. And so we also need to be quite intentional about recognizing the ways in which global health consulting, the ways in which donor funding and funding relationships for health and health programming, how all of those all mimic coloniality and colonial ways. And also unpacking some of the imbalances in the academic global health project, and point out to that we exist beyond the foreign gaze, we exist beyond the Western gaze, and so we really need to think about delinking and moving away from the internalized stereotypes about ourselves as African scholars. And yeah, I'll stop there a little bit, and I can talk about this more. But I'll give Shanaz the opportunity to also respond, or unless you have a different question for her, Joe. Thanks.
Great. No, yeah, Lance, thank you so much. And I think you've, as you say, it's really about saying, right, we can already see the ways in which the language of global health, the global health architecture, is, reinforcing in various ways issues of the colonial past, of the ways in which what we often frame as sort of being assumed to be a neutral good, right? I think for people who don't work directly in the field of public health, global health, etc., there's often an idea that something that's global and about health is implicitly good, right? And its intentions are good. And whilst we know there are many people who work within that architecture, are working within it with the ambitions of doing good, whatever that might be, from their own personal scholarship through to working for different institutions and so on, often we aren't aware of the harm that we're perpetuating or the harm that individuals elsewhere within the system are receiving. So there's also a challenge, I think, for those of us who are involved either in supporting and teaching at postgraduate level, for example, people who are coming through the system as earlier career scholars, all of us as we continue learning. What does that mean as we also become exposed to pieces of a system that we didn't necessarily understand as being dangerous and unhealthy itself, right? I don't know if that makes sense. And I think sort of taking from your points importantly around epistemic injustice, the idea of becoming epistemological, and empirical fodder. There is a question that I don't know if we want to go to it now or maybe return to it at another point, but this idea of the need to be cautious around the ways that we frame decolonial approaches and whether they themselves then invite another form of colonial import when we start thinking about who is undertaking decolonial work, who's framing what work as decolonial, where that's coming from. And, I'm saying this very much as somebody, I'm a white British woman. I've been in South Africa for 17 years. I've been trained both in the UK and in South Africa. And it is interesting watching the debates over the years and who drives what at what time. But importantly, how so much of it doesn't have a strong historical perspective. And so much of it is missing out and ignoring and putting to aside the decades of work of decolonial approaches to research and indigenous research and better understanding the ways that certain forms of knowledge are disregarded and disrespected. So there's also this concern that I think we all sit with a sort of discomfort at times in how the work that's being undertaken today to address systems is sometimes itself then overlooking work that's come before that and can kind of reinforce and rarefy further. But maybe I'm taking us on a tangent. But Shanaz, I wondered if you, sort of building on from Lance's input, sort of what do you think, what do we want global health to be? Is there a thing called global health that would benefit sort of, the spaces in which we are working? Is there a form of global health that would address the challenges that Lance in particular has been outlining? I just wondered any of your thoughts on that. Oh, you're currently muted, sorry.
I really appreciated Lance's input because I think he took us back to come all the way forward to really locate, especially, and I think you did the same too, Joe, to locate your own, both of your experiences in this world, navigating the world, to grapple with the straddling power you sit with, and the powerlessness you sit with, and as bodies, as African bodies, as racialized bodies, as women bodies, as queer bodies, as it becomes an othering, an othering to use terms like global health, because what it does is it shifts the gaze. It shifts the gaze outwardly away from my subjective experience. And the entire experience of health is extremely subjective. It is about me and how I feel physically, emotionally, spiritually, and what are the conditions that constrain these feelings or that enable these feelings. And I think that when you use words like global health, or even in the research world, when we say we are going into the field, we forget that we are actually utilizing words that were designed to oppress, And I sometimes wonder if we have normalized some systems and structures, and well, not we, but they have been normalized, and the power is hidden. And I think that part of what Lance and I are doing through Africa Health Futures is to try to name things that need to be named. So if we want to name global health, we cannot name it without reckoning with the fact that it exists in a racialized system, that it's a tool, a technology for racism. It's a technology for heteropatriarchy. It's a technology for oppression, for othering. And so we've got to get to better words. We have got to start, shifting, delinking, and moving away from these terms. And Sheyi Ambibola said that to make global health truly global is to make global health truly local. And he talks quite a lot in the writings of some of the publications that come in global health journals, because this is the currency and yet another technology of coloniality of knowledge, and the power where the knowledge sits is that those who are writers of global health are not those who experience the lived reality. So their construction of health is limited, and it's limited to their understanding. So it may be a slice of reality, but often it also confuses us as researchers in the South who are trying to publish in a global health journal. And Sheyi goes in to say that we end up writing for the foreign gaze, and we other our own people in our writings of academic global health literature. So I think it's very subtle, the way that the power of coloniality, of power, knowledge, and being, to use Sabelo and Lovu's language, is. And we have got to begin the process of lifting or naming and seeing and sitting in the problem a little bit longer before we rush to a solution. And I really appreciate your engagement with the ways in which decoloniality as a term is being used, because many feminists are afraid that decolonial thinkers do not take seriously the work of feminist literature. And if you go to places like India, where they are using decoloniality to oppress, to elevate caste oppression, and I see in global health, it's a buzzword, really, where a lot of like scholars in the global north have picked up the term without deeply engaging with the call for revolution, for what it really means to distribute power, and what does it mean to interrogate, make decisions on behalf of that kind of power over. So I don't know that I have an alternative word. And Lance said that, in South Africa, we are using the word public health, and Sheyi Ambibola uses the word local. But I think that we've got to start that process of interrogating who are the authors? How much of voice do you have? How much of space do you take up? And are we brave enough to move away? And I think in South Africa, where there is some sort of local funding, it's easier for us to have these conversations. But often once you go to some African countries where the development nature, this development partners, where the local governments are quite, they do not have the power, the budget to deliver basic services, and they're dependent on global health initiatives. That power, that becomes harder to navigate. How do you say no to money, or to money that comes for research, where you are signing away the authority to write your own story, or the authority to make decisions about how the money must be spent? And I think these are the conversations that make it imperative that these decolonial conversations happen on the continent here and not elsewhere. Yeah.
Thank you for that, and for your, for your insights, particularly around, as you say, this sort of where particular frames become a buzzword, they become a currency, right? So I think we've all seen the, decolonizing global health conference in this part of the world, that part of the world, this country, that country, etc. But what that actually means, I mean, it's the same for all of us, right? Wherever we are, what does it mean when we talk about recognizing there is a need to rethink structures and power versus how much we can actually do ourselves? But equally, where is the, what's the word, the like bandwidth given to some of these initiatives? And I definitely hear more about the conferences and the meetings and the workshops happening on decolonial approaches to rethinking what global health is. I hear about those from other parts, from higher income contexts, particularly North America, Europe. And it appears that it has developed this sort of, this kind of like rarefied space where there's, unfortunately, at many times, it comes across as being perceived as something new, as something novel. It's sometimes presented as though, I am the first person who has thought about the injustices in this. The development of new approaches, or starting to think about new approaches rather than going back to existing work that's been done around looking at how we shift power around in the ways in which we can rethink what epistemic justice is, for example. So I suppose it kind of links to this idea of who then should be able to shift this. And the question I'm asking, I guess, is Lance, what do you think the opportunities, but also the real dangers and risks that, particularly for early career scholars within the continent, and South Africa, we know, sits in a slightly different position to other parts of the continent itself, and can be seen in some ways as its own power within the region. What does it mean to take some of those risks that Shanaz was speaking about the fact that we need to find ways to sort of disobey, and we need to find ways to do things differently? And I'm thinking of this particularly within the context of precarious employment. What does it mean to be a emerging and early career scholar who hasn't got a permanent job, for example? What does it mean to be perhaps the first Black or brown person in your department? What does it mean to be the only woman, the only queer person in a space? What risks can you take? And for me, this is something that I think we also need to think about in terms of postgraduate education. What's being taught in the classroom? What are students themselves then comfortable to write about? What do they feel they need to produce to pass an exam, or an examiner to read their thesis? What do scholars at earlier stages of their career, what risks can they take on? And I suppose it's just a question about, I know both of you are navigating that, and the work of your fellowships are allowing you in many ways the space to confront and explore ways to address some of the challenges you've been speaking to. But I just wondered how this can be done and who should take on that responsibility. Like who is there who sits in a position that's secure to ask these questions and challenge many of these norms? Lance, any of your thoughts?
Thank you, Jo. I think it's a very difficult question, because not only am I living it, kind of being a PhD student, trying to understand and navigate the academy, not coming from intergenerational wealth, so the security being quite difficult, also coming from a working class background and moving into this kind of so-called middle classism. So it's also about, you know, about the ways in which you're constantly navigating through these tensions of obviously being quite aware of these oppressive systems and structures, but also needing to use your agency in order to resist, to challenge, to disrupt. And so part of my journey has been to be quite conscious about the unsettling of the forms of coloniality of knowledge, coloniality of power, and coloniality of being in my teaching, my research, in the ways that I engage with the folks that I engage with, whether that is, you know, the sex workers in the advocacy work that I do work on, my relationships with the participants that I engage with in my PhD, and really trying to understand. It's also the work with the ethics committees, needing to really challenge the standard and conventional practices and the normative assumptions that are being made about, you know, about my subjectivity and what, and a lot of the research that I'm doing is actually research of my own subjectivity. So having to really locate yourself, both as the authority, but also the one that have the lived experiences. And I think it's in that process that you really start naming and engaging explicitly with hidden power and the different types of power that you straddle, and how that kind of power and oppression operate to consistently be intentional of not reinforcing coloniality in your research. And there are some really difficult decisions that you will have to make. And that in that process, it's also, I mean, I constantly have been struggling in many ways to negotiate my own agency in the PhD process, in research spaces, in advocacy spaces, and sometimes there are really intense consequences. But for the most part, it's also about trying to find ways of strategizing. And I think this my subjectivity in itself is, and this is also with many other folks, learning from so many Black feminists and African feminists on the continent, and Black African women on the continent, who's doing really important work and who have done this work and have constantly demonstrated the tensions and the navigations, what Alalwane Professor Alalwane Ramagunda calls occupational consciousness, that everyday decisions of trying to understand and use your agency to resist, and being aware and trying to find that although you might have good intentions, you need to understand the parameters in which we operate and think and recognize how we are informed by our lived experiences and our positionality, and write about that as authorities of those experiences and of those realities. And it means critically reflecting and examining our reflexivity in our training, our research, our practices, but it's also in the doing. And this is also the next step, I guess, that we are trying to, both Shanaz and I are trying to really be intentional about, is really thinking about the praxis. What does it require in praxis to really dismantle and to disrupt, to de-link, and be intentional about not perpetuating the very systems of oppression underlying global health and colonial medicine. And the practice of recognizing our own frame and the frame of the people that we engage with, the theories, the knowledges that we've been engaging with, and also asking, where do we look to for the alternatives? And what will allow us and enable us to move away from this. And I think when we had our conversation and we set up a space to grapple with decolonizing African health system, which was the health systems convening, Pascal Alotti really got us to think about how brave are we in the quest for the disruption of coloniality, and how disruptive are we prepared to be, recognizing the stakes. Because it's also the understanding that actually we can't really throw it all out and burn the entire institution down, but we need to reconfigure and understand that, this is also something that we need to think about, is that we can't expect global health in its current configuration and the way in which the structure exists and the practices that exist in this kind of hegemonic structure to be able to address the exact same problems that it has been complicit in reinforcing and perpetuating historically and now. And so it's like the master's house, right? It's the master's house and the master's stools. And so we really need to be able to understand what reconfiguration is needed, and what tools do we need to use and draw on to transform. And not, for me, it's not even radically transforming, right? It's really it's chucking away the entire table of where the oppressor sits, and being able to actually collectively sit on the floor together and make meaning to transform the house. And some would argue that burning the house down is probably the other alternative. I think that it's also very important that and this is also something that's quite important for me, has been intergenerational conversations and being able to really learn from folks who've been doing this work. And that's why the intentional decolonial scholarship, African feminist scholars on the continent and drawing on their wisdom has been fundamental for how we are entering into this work in the space. And so that has been crucial in learning how to reconfigure and where to look to. But also to be able to understand the value and the power of the knowledge that exists by people who are living the experiences. So like the knowledge, like the sex workers that I work with are all knowledgeable, and they're deeply insightful, and recognizing the limitations of my own frame in the academy. There are big limitations. And straddling that is important, and recognizing that in this power, in this imperial power design is important. So relinquishing power and taking up power when it's appropriate is equally important. So finding those different points has been so difficult. Sorry, Jo, for
no, nothing to apologize for. I mean, I would, we need to set up a series of these conversations. I am aware, however, of time. And I think maybe what would be good is Shanaz, I'll come to you next, and then back to Lance, but just for some final short reflections, if it's possible. But for me, one of the things that I feel is so important is the recognition of the ways in which epistemic injustice is embedded in all of this, right? And I fear we don't speak about that sufficiently. I fear that the issue of around the knower, the knowing, the knowledge, and the ways in which epistemic systems and power relationships, and the ways in which those play out in various ways, we've touched on many of them today, but how those are ultimately at the center of all of this. And it's, again, where this kind of challenge to ourselves and to others within the governance architectures and the structures that we all live and work in, is what questions are we asking of the ways in which we're doing research, right? So beyond, as you say, I mean, it's points that you've raised too about positionality of the self, positionality within communities, what it means to be going through different systems and structures of change yourself within those spaces, what access to knowledge one has. But importantly for me, and there's some of the work that we've been doing at the center is around questioning the whole thing of what this language of knowledge politics is. And most importantly, and you touched on it, Lance, and the work that I know that you've been involved in, where this idea that somehow knowledge is produced through a research process, through something called research, rather than the fact that knowledge exists, and there might be some form of curating that knowledge, there might be some approach that as a researcher we bring in to ask different questions of the knowledge that is existing. But when we're doing work that is drawing explicitly and is driven explicitly by experiences of people, i.e. what a public health approach is about, the constant questions and tensions around this idea of who holds the power at what point. The knower has the power, but perhaps the researcher has the power in terms of the money, right? The power because they hold the PhD and they're perceived, they're given a position that they themselves might not feel comfortable holding, and the way that is constantly reproduced. So now I'm taking up the time, but I wondered, Shanaz, if you've got, I'll give you a minute of any final tie-up comment that you'd like to make, and the same to you, Lance, and then we're going to come to a close.
Yeah, I mean, I think that so much has been covered, but I just was like reflecting on what Lance was saying about his approach, and it already left me feeling pretty exhausted because it's true that a lot of those people who come from previously disadvantaged communities, from post-colonial, so-called post-colonial contexts, have experienced major traumas, and a lot of the traumas we still sit with today. And so the experiences of being a person of color in the academic space, which is a very structurally violent space, is really something we've got to reckon with. And we as people who have trauma, we have got a lot of healing to do. And to me, it strikes me as, what is the point of health? What is the point of being a healer? What is the point of global health? And what is social justice? Where's the social justice imperative in all of this? Where are we going to? And it seems to me that in the current state of global health architecture, it is a commodified version of health. So our bodies make money for some pharmaceutical countries, and ill health is the benefit of some and to the detriment of others. And I think what we're trying to shift is that our politicization of our new construction of health is to recenter the importance of the politics of care, of love, of caring for the environment, of rehumanization of every human being, of shifting the debate away from commodification to why can't we have vaccines for every human being who exists on this planet today. And I think it's in that element, and why do we still sit with a construction of mental health that is not benefiting most of us? It's inaccessible, it's unaffordable, and yet most of us sit with deep historic traumas. And unfortunately, a traumatized psyche is a dangerous place because those who are oppressed start to oppress others. And I think we have got to begin to wake up a little bit to the nature of the problem that we've normalized. And I think this is, I suppose, why Lance and I are so passionate about this, is we don't want to fit into a structure of knowledge that is living in an illusion that there is a way forward if we continue with the status quo. So yeah, that's from me. And I think we've started African Health Futures. We want to offer it as a space for other activists, research activists, people who are interested in this movement, of this agenda for change, to join us and to contribute. And yeah, we're hoping to build, to reimagine our futures. And Lance, earlier we were talking, and he was asking, what does it mean to be a free thinking human being? What does it mean for us to have our own thoughts, And I think these are questions that have got to be have more airtime rather than this sort of global health solution driven model where we think we've already got the solutions, but they're sitting in Geneva or and not. And as Sabelo and Bacheni has said, we've got to shift the geography and the biography of knowledge. We've got to look in places that we don't ordinarily look at for where knowledge lies. And this is maybe in our homes or amongst us, or when we sit on the carpet or we sit over a cup of tea, this is where we've got to sit. So thank you for this opportunity, Joe.
Thank you so much, Shanaz. Thank you. Lance, any final thoughts, at least for this conversation?
Just to extend a warm and huge gratitude to you, Joe, for this opportunity. I think my final kind of reflections is that really in this quest of decoloniality as a process, decolonizing as a process, I think that it's important for us as scholars and emerging scholars to seek genuine measures of resistance and liberation. And so in our writings, I mean, we've drawn on Audre Lorde's quote that, a lot of our measures of resistance and liberation must come from somewhere else, somewhere outside, whether outside of the Western canon, outside of mainstream academia, outside of modern political institution structures and social processes, or perhaps outside of history altogether. And we would argue probably outside of global health. And so for us, African scholars in particular who are situated and deeply steeped in global health, we need a political consciousness. We need an African consciousness that centers solidarity, that centers the wealth of African knowledges and African philosophies, cosmologies, praxis, ways of being and ways of doing from the multiplicity of contexts on the continent as worthy of inquiry, as worthy and legitimate as knowledge holders, and as valid and important for our own healing and well-being and health. And I think that's, for me, what's really important as a continental conversation. And so that's probably but thank you so much to you,
Wonderful.
Joe.
Thank you, Lance. Thank you both so much for being so generous with your insights and reflections. And obviously people where you'll find this video, there's obviously links also to other work that both Shanaz and Lance have been part of. And hopefully this will be a continuing conversation. I just wanted to end with a shout out in a way. It was reminding me there's a fantastic edited book that is called Humanizing Research. And it's a fantastic collection that really thinks about the important role that qualitative inquiry can play in engaging with marginalized and indigenous groups. And in this case, it's particularly around thinking about work with youth in classrooms. It's a US-based initiative that drew on the experiences of predominantly first-generation US scholars working with many undocumented Mexican students. And just really interesting reflections that brings together a lot of what you were talking about. And I think really importantly, it's about recognizing, and I think many of us in the public health, let's say that frame, recognize the importance of colleagues working in the disciplines for coming together and supporting us in our work and our role in working across those disciplinary perspectives. And it can sometimes be very difficult. That in itself, I feel, is another form of epistemic injustice sometimes in how disciplines and more interdisciplinary spaces get pitted against each other unfairly. And it's one of the things that I think this book does really well, is really help bring some of those different tensions together. Anyway, so thank you once again. Please stay well, and we will be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Joe.
Bye.